How can I help you?
Mr. Tesla, I'm Detective Murdoch of the Toronto Police. Excuse me. Yes. Dr. Gilbert Perkins. Yes. Detective William Murdoch, Toronto Police. Mr. Doyle. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
I suppose it's a book you'd like me to sign?
No. We have an engagement. My name's William Murdoch.
You, sir? Good God, man, I was expecting someone twice your age.
Detective William Murdoch.
Yes. How do you do, Detective? Couldn't help it over here. Terrible tragedy.
Jeffrey. George. George Crabtree. Hello, Philip. My name is Detective William Murdoch.
Who are you?
My name is Detective William Murdoch.
Oh, my God.
Guard. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy. Detective William Murdoch. I need to ask you some questions.
I'm afraid there's no admittance without a membership card.
This is my membership card.
Then you'll need to use the tradesman's entrance.
Gentlemen, I'm Detective Murdoch. This is Constable Crabtree. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Mr. Briggs. Detective William Murdoch.
Pleasure, sir.
Mr. Horton, I'm Detective Murdoch. What can you tell me about your last meeting with Dr. Grout? Gentlemen. I'm Detective William Murdoch of the Toronto Police. Are you Jake and Kirk McIsaac? Detective William Murdoch.
Inspector Thomas Brackenreed.
Edgar Sims.
Detective William Murdoch.
Inspector Thomas Brackenreed.
I'm Detective William Murdoch.
Yes, I'm Paul Wilson, his honor's son.
Yes, of course. Mr. Wilson, how can I help you? Professor Godfrey. Detective William Murdoch. I'm investigating Professor Bennett's murder. Dr. Goldberg, isn't it?
And you are?
Detective William Murdoch, and this is Constable George Crabtree. We're here to see Miss Begelman. Detective William Murdoch, here to see Mr. Begel.
I'd like you to meet Reginald Poundset. This is William...
Detective William Murdoch.
A pleasure.
Jimmy, actually. Jimmy McLeod.
Detective William Murdoch, nice to meet you, Jimmy.
The same.
Yes?
Detective William Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary. Chief, I'm Detective William Murdoch of the Toronto Constabulary, and I implore you to listen to what I have to say. My name is Detective William Murdoch with the Toronto Constabulary.
And this gentleman.
Detective William Murdoch of the Toronto Constabulary. Mr. Pendrick, Detective William Murdoch of the Toronto Constabulary. Mrs. Rebecca Hastings?
Yes? How can I help you?
I'm Detective William Murdoch of the Toronto Constabulary. Detective Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary, identify yourself.
Ronald Beaton.
Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Bird.
The same. And you are?
Detective William Murdoch of the Toronto Constabulary. Detective William Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary.
Thank you for coming, Detective.
Je suis l'inspecteur William Murdoch, monsieur. Vos papiers, s'il vous plaît. Detective William Murdoch. And this is our pathologist, Dr. Francis.
State your business, sir.
Detective William Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary. I'm here to investigate the death of Corporal Joseph Fryer.
What is Mr. Prenfrew doing here?
I'm Detective William Murdoch of the Toronto Constabulary.
Explain yourselves.
Mother.
Detective William Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary. And you are?
Mrs. Hansworth, Mr. Whitaker's housekeeper.
How may I be of service, gentlemen?
Reverend Mother, I'm Detective Will. Daniel. I'm Detective Murdoch. I need to know what happened the night that Amy Goldham died.
You have a good eye, Mr.
Murdoch, William Murdoch.
Dr. Iris Pajali.
Sir, when will my guests be allowed to leave?
Detective William Murdoch. I'm afraid everyone here will have to be questioned. Detective Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary.
Yes, you've made that deafeningly clear. I can hear again.
Gentlemen, Toronto Constabulary. Gentlemen, I'm a detective with the Toronto Constabulary. It's your duty to tell me the truth. Detective Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary. Detective William Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary. Hello, I'm Detective Murdoch of the Toronto...
I know very well who you are, sir.
Detective Murdoch, Inspector Brackenreed, Toronto Constabulary. Detective William Murdoch.
Of course. Detective William Murdoch, Constable George Crabtree. This is Leslie Garland.
You are? Detective Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary. Detective William Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary. Mr. Fuller, my name is Detective William Murdoch of the Toronto Constabulary. I'm afraid I have some rather unhappy news. Detective William Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary. And you are?
I'm Miss Rosina Din.
You're sweating so much in this heat.
Mr. Bennett, is it? Detective William Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary. Mr. Roundhill, I'm Detective William Murdoch of the Toronto Constabulary. You asked for a policeman.
Please.
I'm Miss Dignan. How can I help you?
Detective William Murdoch of the Toronto Constabulary.
Who am I speaking to?
Detective William Murdoch, Toronto Constabulary, sir.